The cost of living and even hardships are rising. And you can see that it is actually punctuated also by the overlapping multiple shocks that have hit the country, negative shocks. And negative shocks that are persistent are always very, very difficult to predict in terms of their magnitude, the quantum, and even direction. So in a sense, the world over is actually suffering from that. But we have a new dimension in the Horn of Africa, and especially in Kenya, because the drought effect is actually a very major supply-side shock that drives domestic prices and also drives energy prices. And this is where the pain, most pain is coming from. I do recall one time in my presentation to the Parliament, I argued that the then Parliamentary Committee in Finance, that we need to create buffers in the economy so that when there are supply-side shocks, we can actually at least mitigate in the short term. And those buffers, for example, related to food security. Of course, it's expensive to store cereals for a long time, but the best thing is actually to have resources to do that, to buy at that particular time. Energy resources, that is petroleum backups. And then, of course, we should have buffers in terms of fiscal space. And finally, we should have buffers from the central bank in terms of foreign exchange reserves. Those are four main buffers that can help us navigate in the short term. But unfortunately, when the shock hits us, for example, right now, if you look at that, it's only perhaps the central bank which has foreign exchange reserves. And you can see that essentially it's going to be problematic. But then, what we really need is actually physical intervention to create some space and even to save lives. But again, it comes in at a time when we don't have that fiscal space. Especially, you mentioned the debt. We are in agreement with that. I think right now, the way the situation is, given the multiple shocks, and even the supply-side shocks that are quite prevalent, the best would be to look for concessional financing that would retire most of the debt, especially the domestic debt, which is very, very expensive. It's taking quite a large proportion of recurrent expenditure, about to the tune of about 3%. So that will be the starting point. And then after that, we'll have some time, that is in the very short term. Then over time, the fiscal space can be rebuilt, including reforms that may come up actually to improve the revenue side. Because right now, the biggest problem is the revenue side. So essentially, one of the lessons that we should pick up from here is actually how to deal with supply-side shocks. It was always a problem even during my time. Because one of the things about the supply-side shock and monetary policy phenomena is that you have to actually tighten monetary policy to ride over the shocks. But essentially what you do is actually to push the economy into a temporary recession, hoping that once the supply shocks are resolved, we do not have that plateau of high prices. We will destroy that. But if there is pain, by the time you do that, and even when the supply-side issues are resolved, this is the pain we have to undergo, we have to wait for. But I do believe that the most important steps is always to make sure that we have fiscal space that can now allow us some flexibility to ride over the shocks. And that is going to be created by, first of all, resolving or reprofiling the debt that we have, having some concessional funding that is going to retire some of the most expensive domestic debt.